Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring how one of the world's absolute oldest nations has continually managed to rebuild itself from the ashes of fallen empires. We're looking at a story of just incredible, mind-bending resilience. It's a narrative I like to call the Phoenix Arc.
I want you to keep this one big question in the back of your mind. How exactly does a nation survive for 3,000 years? I mean, really think about it. They literally outlasted the Romans, the Persians, the Arabs, the Ottomans, and the Soviets. When you're geographically wedged right in the middle of expanding global superpowers, survival isn't just about having a strong army. It's about something much, much deeper.
To make sense of over 3 millennia of complex history, here's our roadmap. We'll start with their ancient roots in Urartu, look at how they became the first Christian nation, travel through medieval kingdoms, and discuss the era of empires, tragedy, and diaspora. Then, we'll wrap up with Soviet rule and what their modern identity looks like today.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Ancient Roots and Urartu. The sheer scale of Armenian history is honestly hard to wrap your head around. We are talking about early Neolithic settlements in the Lake Savan Basin going as far back as the 10th millennium BC. By the 9th century BC, the Proto-Armenian tribes had formed the powerful Kingdom of Urartu, and if we fast forward a bit to the 1st century BC, we hit the absolute zenith of Greater Armenia. Under the rule of Tigranes the Great, the kingdom expanded massively, taking in regions of Asia Minor, northern Mesopotamia, and Syria, and they actually held their own against the mighty Roman Empire.
What's totally fascinating in the source material is how advanced that ancient Urartian kingdom was before it eventually collapsed in the 6th century BC. These guys weren't just ancient warriors, they were absolute master engineers. They were the very first in the Middle East to invent the citadel, building heavily fortified stone structures on these sheer, impossible-looking rocky hills. And they built incredibly advanced hydraulic works, irrigation canals, and dams. The text actually credit them with establishing the Middle East's very first national water policy. They laid down infrastructural roots that fundamentally shaped the whole region.
Moving right along to Section 2, the first Christian nation. Let's see how they built their ultimate cultural armor. Okay, so here is a massive turning point. In 301 AD, under the guidance of Gregory the Illuminator, Armenia became the first nation in the world to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. And this brought about the role of the Catholicos, the supreme guide of the Armenian Apostolic Church. So why does this matter so much? Well, the Catholicos became this incredibly powerful, unifying figurehead. Even when the nation was physically fractured or being ruled by outside empires, the Catholicos stood tall as the independent guardian of their national identity. They basically weaponized their cultural identity for survival, and the sources break this down into 3 steps. Step 1 was adopting Christianity, which was a direct pushback against being assimilated into the Persian Zoroastrian faith. But step 2 is where it gets really brilliant. In 405 AD, a scholar named Mesrop Mashtats invented a totally unique 36-letter Armenian alphabet. This wasn't just some cool linguistic side project, it was a highly deliberate strategy for survival. Step 3 shows how they immediately used it to translate the Bible and other sacred texts. This meant their religion, their literature, and their culture could thrive completely independently of Greek or Persian influence. They essentially built an impenetrable fortress out of words.
Which brings us to Section 3, Medieval Kingdoms and Crossroads.
Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. As you can see, Armenia faced intense geopolitical pressure from literally every direction. The Byzantine Empire basically used them as a shield, a buffer state against Islamic and Persian expansion. Then the Arab Caliphate swept in and conquered the region, splitting the state into pieces. By the 1050s, the Seljuk Turks invaded, which absolutely devastated their agricultural lands and forced mass migrations. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the 13th century Mongol incursions brought severe economic decline. Yet despite foreign superpowers constantly carving up their map, Armenian dynasties like the Bagratuni managed to preserve their distinct identity through their unique architecture, religion, and literature.
And this right here perfectly illustrates that Phoenix Arc I mentioned earlier. When they were forcefully driven out of their ancestral highlands by the Seljuk invasions, the Armenians didn't just give up and fade into history. They just packed up, migrated south to the Mediterranean coast, and built a flourishing brand new kingdom, the Kingdom of Cilicia. They actually allied with European crusaders and created this powerful cosmopolitan state that beautifully blended traditional Armenian culture with Western European trade and diplomacy. They adapted, they relocated, and they thrived.
Now the narrative takes a much darker turn as we enter Section 4, Empires, Tragedy, and Diaspora.
Before we get to the heavy tragedies of the 20th century, the source texts make a point to highlight another incredible period of rebirth, known as the Zartunk, which translates to awakening. Starting in the late 18th century, largely pioneered by the Mekhitarist Catholic monastic order over in Venice, a new Armenian intellectuality emerged. They published over 1,000 books, periodicals, and newspapers. This was just a massive intellectual modernization process, all aimed at unifying the national consciousness of a people who were at the time scattered across different empires.
Based objectively on the historical records detailed in our source material, we have to look at this deeply tragic number, 1.5 million. This represents the estimated number of Armenians killed between 1915 and 1923. During this period, the Ottoman Empire engaged in the systematic extermination and mass deportation of the Armenian people from eastern Anatolia and their historic lands. It is a profound historical tragedy that permanently altered the trajectory of the entire nation.
The historical texts emphasize that this massive forced displacement created a divided yet unbelievably resilient global diaspora. Survivors were scattered mostly across the Middle East, Europe, and North America. But rather than just dissolving into their new host countries and losing their roots, they formed a global diasporic nation. They built extensive networks of charity and cultural interaction. They literally carried the Armenian identity across the globe, constantly performing this delicate balancing act, integrating into their new homelands while fiercely preserving their ancient heritage.
A really fascinating consequence of all this history is how geopolitical division quite literally split their ancient language right down the middle. On one side, we have Western Armenian, which developed from dialects within the Ottoman Empire and is used mostly by the diaspora today. On the other side is Eastern Armenian, which evolved from Persian dialects and was later heavily shaped by the spelling reforms of the Soviet Union.
Let's jump into Section 5, Soviet Rule and Rebirth.
So independence in the early 20th century was incredibly fleeting. In 1918, right out of the collapse of Tsarist Russia, the First Republic of Armenia was proudly proclaimed, but it didn't last long. By 1920, facing the serious threat of a Turkish invasion, they were forced into incorporation with the Soviet Union pretty much just to survive. For the next 70 years, their cultural preservation was put in a deep freeze, existing strictly within tight Soviet boundaries. It wasn't until 1988, following a truly devastating earthquake in Spitak, that massive popular protests finally ignited, setting the stage for the collapse of Soviet rule.
Finally, Part 6, Modern Identity and Heritage. Let's look at where they stand today. In 1991, they actually did it. For the first time in nearly 600 years, Armenia re-established a sovereign, independent state. But, as the sources point out, stepping into independence meant immediately facing the incredibly harsh realities of the post-Soviet world. The young republic had to navigate a severe economic collapse, figure out a highly complex transition to democracy, and endure intense regional conflicts, specifically the conflict with neighboring Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh.
So how do they survive today as a small, landlocked nation? The sources outline 4 strategic pillars they rely on. They have to balance really delicate relations with global powers by maintaining military deterrence, seeking sustainable economic growth and foreign investment, and leaning heavily on international law. Crucially, though, they also lean on their massive global diaspora. They use cultural promotion and outreach to maintain a strong nation-state identity that stretches way beyond their actual physical borders on a map.
I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful thought from the source material. It's a line from a poem about the Armenian destiny. The Armenians have lived, live, and will live again. Considering everything we've covered in this explainer today, from inventing their very own alphabet, to the fierce preservation of their church, to literal rebirths in totally new geographies, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What ancient cultural armors do we rely on in our own societies today to ensure our survival? It's a fascinating question to chew on. Thanks so much for exploring the Phoenix Arc with me today.